Hi, and welcome to today's conversation on accelerating the adoption of AI through better trustworthy processes. I am Thomas Williams, equity analyst at Cape Capital, and I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Lofred Madzou. Lofred is the director of strategy at Trueera, a Silicon Valley startup that offers software solutions to test, debug, explain, and monitor machine learning models. Outside of his day job, he is a research associate at the University of Oxford, where he develops methods to audit AI systems. And before joining Trueera, Lofred was an AI lead at the World Economic Forum, where he advised global companies across jurisdictions and industries on implementing trustworthy AI processes. He also advised various EU and Asia-Pacific countries on AI regulation. And previously, he was a policy officer at the French Digital Council, where he advised the French government on AI regulation, and most notably, co-drafted the National AI Strategy. And finally, Lofred holds a master's degree in both data science and philosophy from the University of Oxford. Well, it's quite a CV, Lofred. Welcome to our conversation, and how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Thomas.
So let's start by establishing the current state of affairs. There has been a lot of excitement surrounding AI, especially generative AI. Do you see this as justified or mostly just hype?
Well, that's a great question. AI has been through so many hype cycles that one might wonder if there's anything different with generative AI. I do think personally that generative AI and LLMs are game changers, and we have a few key indicators confirming that something very transformative is happening. First, we observe massive adoption. Here, let's just think about ChatGPT. It took only 2 months for this app to reach over 100 million users. This has never happened in the past. Second, AI is much more accessible. Again, thinking about ChatGPT, it doesn't require any data science degree to interact with the app because user questions and responses are in plain English. Third, these models are incredibly versatile. Again, thinking about LLMs, they can handle a wide variety of NLP tasks, from text generation, obviously, but also summarization, search, extraction. This is a stark contrast to classic ML models, which were notoriously narrow in applicability. So I do think that something very transformative is happening.
And yet, AI remains very underutilized in many industries, despite its potential for transformative impact. Do you see this changing anytime soon?
I hope so, but the truth is scaling AI is quite complicated, it's quite challenging. There are a few key barriers holding organizations, and here I'm thinking about the lack of talent in many organizations or cultural barriers. Another one that comes to mind is data quality. Often they have poor data quality. But the one I want to dive in today with you is really the lack of trust in AI systems. So put very simply, many actors, industry actors, but also citizens or even regulators are worried about the risks associated with AI. And that's one of the main barriers to AI adoption at the moment.
And what is the general sentiment regarding regulators? Is it more optimistic or is it more cautious?
Well, I cannot really comment on their sentiments, but judging by the activity, I would say that there is no clear, outright opposition to AI at the moment. What there is a willingness to make sure that AI systems are trustworthy, meaning that their behaviors are consistent with a set of requirements. They must be fair, they must be transparent, they must be traceable, and this is really consistent across jurisdictions. Obviously in the EU at the moment with the future adoption of the EU AI Act, but also in the US, if you have read the executive order published by President Biden last week, that's a fairly convergent goal by regulators across jurisdictions.
And how can we balance the need to regulate AI with the need to promote the technology?
Well, if you don't mind, I would slightly tweak the question because I do think that good regulation actually builds trust in AI, which in turn unlock innovation. So the real question for me is, how do we build trust in AI systems so as to unlock innovation? I think that's a rather more promising or a better way to looking at it.
And how can we ensure that AI regulations are effective, but also flexible enough to adapt to the rapid pace of change in the field?
Well, that's a tricky one because regulating complex technologies such as AI is really challenging. I think the key, though, is to hold organizations using AI accountable. That should be the goal of any regulator. And this doesn't require to ban the technology or even telling industry actors how to use the technology. Instead, it requires setting up clear expectations, requirements about the outcomes that we want from this technology. And here, let me give you a concrete example. Many regulators are worried that the use of AI for recruitment may end up widening existing disparities between demographic groups. That's a legitimate concern. But again, instead of banning the technology, if used appropriately, AI can actually improve or increase opportunities for groups that have been historically disadvantaged. So there's a clear potential benefit here. But to mitigate the risk, organizations building and deploying AI must make sure that they have the right governance processes and the right tools to mitigate the risk for unfair bias. And this should be required by regulation. Also, that process of mitigating these risks should be documented, and this document should be available to regulators or judges in the case of litigation. Another potential option is to require external audit of these AI systems. That's also a way to make sure that actors are doing the right thing.
All right, let's dive in a bit. What are some key challenges and risks associated with AI?
So risks are really context dependent. So instead of having a rather conceptual discussion, I would like again to give you a concrete example. This will make it easier for viewers to follow as well. Consider the use of AI for credit. You and I know that the ability to get access to credit is critical in our society, either for social mobility, but also personal fulfillment and many other good reasons. On the other hand, we also know that AI can actually improve credit decisions, and that's why many banks are deploying AI systems at the moment. And what they need to do is to make sure that as they deploy this technology, because of its clear benefits, they must have the right processes and tooling around to mitigate some risks. What are the risks that they may face or challenges? One of them is explainability. As I said, you can have very accurate model, high-performing model, but they tend to be black boxes, meaning that explaining the decision-making processes is quite complex. But again, we have tools to actually explain ML models, including the ones offered by Trueera. Banks should have such tools available and being able to justify their decision. Because as a consumer, I'm entitled to know why I got rejected from that loan or mortgage application. A related risk that may manifest in that specific context is the risk of unfair bias. Again, you can have a very highly accurate model on the overall population, but it may be the case that this model is unfairly biased against specific segments of your population. Banks should have the right tools to identify that potential bias, justify it, is it justified or not, and then debug the model if it is unjustified and get the model back into production. So, for instance, it may be the case that when we look more closely, you are less likely to get a loan if you are a young female worker in Ticino versus a young male worker in Geneva. Some of this may be justified because there are different job markets, you have different salaries, but some of it may not be justified. Either way, the bank should have the right processes and tools to identify, justify, and debug the model if needed.
And how can we identify and mitigate these risks? I'm thinking lack of transparency or unfair biases.
Well, again, important question. I guess here the key thing, as I said, risks are really context dependent. But the key thing here is to have a clear understanding of what are the applicable regulations, standards, guidelines for your specific use case. Again, start with a business use case, right? I mentioned recruitment, I mentioned credits. You need to understand within your industry, within your specific context, whatever relevant regulations or standards applicable, and also whatever risks you want to mitigate that are related to that specific use case. Once you map out all the applicable regulations, standards, and policies, then you need to be able to test your ML model against, or AI model against these requirements. And again, we have tools to do exactly this. And based on these results, you can then determine if the model is of high quality, and meaning literally that its behavior is consistent with all these requirements or not. And there may be some areas around explainability or fairness where it's not the case. Once you have identified these areas, you should be able to debug the model and get it back into production. But it really starts by mapping out applicable regulations, standards, and then test your model against these requirements.
Very interesting. Could you give us a brief overview of what Trueera does, key methodologies, and how it debugs models?
Yes, happy to do so. Well, Trueera offers a full lifecycle AI observability solution that helps you test, debug, monitor, and explain machine learning models. And it works for both discriminative and generative AI models. So here, discriminative refers to a class of ML models used to either classify or predict data. And I gave you an example before when I was talking about credit, right? When you apply for a credit or for a mortgage, you have two potential possible outcomes. You're either approved or rejected, right? Well, we offer tools to improve the quality of such models. We do the same thing for discriminative but non-binary model. And here I'm thinking about, let's say, you are trying to predict the values of properties in the California real estate market. That would be a good example. Here again, we offer a full set of tools to help you ensure that this model is of high quality. How do we do this? So what's the technology, the method, behind this? So what we do is we compute the feature importance to determine the individual contribution of each variable on the overall behavior of the model. That's an optimized version of Shapley values for the viewers that are familiar with this methodology. Instead that SHAP, the open source package to compute Shapley values, is quite limited to 1,000 samples, where we can compute over 1 million examples at scale and quite quickly. So no, we have much more capabilities here. But the theory behind it is pretty much the same. And here again, let's make it really concrete. Going back on the credit example, when you have a credit model, it actually looks at various variables: loan installments, salaries, years of employment, and so forth. But once you start to understand what is the impact of each variable on the overall decision, you understand what is driving the behavior of your model. You're getting at the why the model does X or does Y. Concretely, if I'm looking at this credit model, it turns out that in computing the feature importance, it turns out that your salary accounts for over 50% of the decision being made, and maybe loan installment only 5%. Well, if I do this consistently for all the variables that are in my model, I get an understanding of what is driving, what are the main drivers of my model. Once you get to the why, you can start address overall quality requirements, such as fairness. Again, you understand why the model does something, you can start to understand why the model is unfairly biased against specific demographic, and so forth. So it really comes down to our ability to explain the behavior of a model, and that's what we do with with classic ML. For generative AI, it's a different beast, but the philosophy is still similar. So for viewers that are not familiar with generative AI, this refers to deep learning models that can learn from raw data and generate new outputs based on these learned patterns. And again, a great example of generative AI app is ChatGPT, right? For this type of model, we have come up with a new tool called Trueera that helps you track and evaluate LLM-based applications using feedback functions. A feedback function takes as input the text generated from your LLM, some metadata, and return a score. And when you look at all your feedback functions, you get an understanding of how well your model is performing and what is driving its behavior. Again, I can give you a concrete example here. Many banks and insurers, but that's true across industries, are trying to build their own version of ChatGPT, being able to address basically internal chatbot, right, to augment their employees and address customer queries. An emerging paradigm for this type of use case is called retrieval augmented generation. Again, another fancy term, but it's quite simply to understand. What the banks or the insurance wants to do is to make sure that the answers are grounded on their internal knowledge base. They have been in the business for decades. They have very high quality data. So for instance, imagine that we have built this insurance GPT and we ask questions about underwriting. One of our clients wants to build a car manufacturing plant in some part of Turkey. And as an employee of this company, I want to know how to draft a contract and know whatever risk factor that I should consider. Well, surely we have knowledge on this in my internal database. So I'm going to plug my LLM to that internal database, and I can use Trueera to actually analyze the contextual relevance of the piece of information that has been retrieved to produce the answer, right? So what it does concretely is going to look at what chunks of documentation have been used to address that question. Is it relevant to the question that was being asked? Concretely, this paragraph is really talking about underwriting, commercial underwriting for car manufacturer, commercial underwriting for car manufacturer in Turkey. And I give you a score between 0 to 1. 1 being yes, that's exactly the right context to produce that answer. 0 being, well, that's completely that's not the right context at all. You should be looking at another part of my documentation. That's what we offer for LLM-based applications.
Fascinating. What are your typical clients and what industries do you target?
So we're mostly in financial services at the moment, but also tech and retail. And we're expanding in other industries, but I would say like that's the main focus. FS, banks, insurers, tech, and retail.
Thank you very much. And lastly, what makes you hopeful about the future of AI?
The progress we've made, frankly. I've been in that space for 7 years, and when I joined, we had grandiose claims about how AI is going to revolutionize pretty much everything. Some of these claims are still there, but in the meantime, we have started to understand that without appropriate governance, AI creates some serious risks. And again, we covered some of these risks during our conversation. And this acknowledgement or growing awareness, I think it's a better term, has created a multi-stakeholder demand for trusted AI systems. And we have seen all kinds of actors trying to address that demand. We have seen dozens of governance frameworks being published from public and private organizations. Now we're seeing regulators stepping in and producing the first AI regulations. We are seeing also standard setting organizations doing a lot of work in this area. And here I'm thinking more specifically about Sensenelec, which has the exclusive mandate to turn the EU AI Act into a set of standards once the legislation is adopted. And all that effort has actually made AI more trustworthy. Now we know what are these requirements, and we have also tools to test these ML models against these requirements. Trueera offers some of these tools, but there's a vibrant, I would say, trustworthy AI startup ecosystem. So that's a fantastic development. I know 7 years is a long time from a tech perspective. You have time to, now I'm in startups, so you have time to die 10 times in 7 years. But from a governance perspective, it's quite fast. Also, I'm quite excited for what's coming next. As I said, we moved from AI's magic can do everything to, well, wait a minute. There are some associated risks. How are we going to mitigate these risks? We came up with the right requirements and the right tools to test these models. And now I think what we're going to see in the next few years is we'll be able to certify some of these models, at least for classic ML. We should be able to say that model is actually compliant with these specific standards, adding an additional layer of trust into AI. So when I look back, I think that's a fantastic development.
Great, thank you very much, Lofred. That was very interesting. And this concludes our conversation on accelerating the adoption of AI through better trustworthy processes.
Thank you.